Temple University. This is Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with authors and illustrators prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
Welcome to Profiles in Literature. Today's guests are the Newbery Medal winner, Eleanor Estes from New Haven, Connecticut, and her editor of long-standing, Margaret McElderry. When did Margaret begin as your editor, Eleanor?
Well, I think that was with the publication of The Sleeping Giant, right?
That's right.
I devoted a number of years after writing The 100 Dresses to writing a novel for adults. And during that time, Margaret was learning to be the most wonderful children's editor. And then my first book with her was The Sleeping Giant. The second book was Ginger Pie, which was the book you spoke of as having been awarded the Newbery Medal.
And do you two still work together now?
We do, I'm very glad to say.
Margaret's very tolerant of me. Sometimes I call her up from Rome when I was working on The Alley and met my husband in Paris, and I had the galleys with me. And, well, the phone bill, and you must admit I was very generous because I didn't reverse the charge about corrections in the galley.
Now, that was our most dramatic
That was dramatic.
working session.
Well, I want to tell you that sharing these old friends with me is my colleague on the Profiles in Literature series, Carolyn Field, coordinator of the Office on Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Also
Now,
an old friend.
An old friend of yours, yes. How long have you two known each other?
You
Well,
were saying earlier.
Less than 39 years.
Oh, well, then this is Old Home Week for all of us. Let's take a look at your Newbery Medal. And tell me, please, what did you win it for? Say it again.
The Newbery Medal was awarded to Ginger Pie, and that was the second book that I worked on with Margaret, and I was stunned. My husband and I were living in California at the time. My husband had just come back east to a library job in the east, and I and my daughter and mother-in-law was still in California, and one day the telephone rang, and it was Margaret, and she said, "Eleanor, Ginger Pie has won the Newbery Medal." Well, I was so astonished that I dropped the phone. It was really astonishing to me. So when I began the acceptance speech, that's why I said, you may think that this is the first time I've won the Newbery Medal, but it isn't, because I've given the Newbery Medal acceptance speech lots and lots of times in my dreams. And now it's true. I cherish it very, very much.
And the year when it was awarded to you was?
Was 1952.
And wasn't that a historic year for you as an editor?
Yes, how clever of you to know that. Because that year, Eleanor's book won the Newbery, and Finders Keepers, illustrated by Nicholas Mordvinoff, won the Caldecott Award, the first time one publisher had both awards in the same year.
That's great.
That's right.
I thought it was The Two Reds.
No, Finders Keepers, their second
Keepers
book.
Was the
That's
award winner.
That's right.
A lot of the readers do not realize, however, that you also illustrated Ginger Pie, and I wonder if we can have a view of one of your drawings, that showing Sam Duty's car.
Yes, that's Ford of that period, based on my imagination, really. I didn't go to an old automobile museum to check on details, but I remember that when Louis Slobodkin was drawing a motorcycle in the middle Moffat, he said, well, I have to make this up. I really don't know what a motorcycle looked like. And if you examine a drawing like that, there aren't very many lines, you see. It's just a hint at an old Ford.
It's a powerful suggestion. We also have several other Estes original drawings for two books that you wrote. One is a little oven, and I'd like to know what medium you used.
Well, both A Little Oven and The Sleeping Giant were watercolors entirely.
We have another drawing now from The Sleeping Giant.
I didn't do the color separations as most artists are able to do, and I was not able to do them. So you'll see that the original for this little oven drawing is sharper, brighter than the reproductions, but I think whoever that person was, she did a wonderful job.
That's very good of you. It was a struggle, I remember.
Yes, it was.
We also have a piece of sculpture with us, and I wonder if you could tell us from what book it comes.
Well, that's the Upside Down Jane, and that's from the first Moffats, the Moffats. And she had a way, if you have read the book, of looking at the world sort of upside down between her legs, because the world looks so much sharper and clearer and brighter, and I'm sure you've all had that same experience as children. And I think most writers and most artists try to maintain that illusion sort of seeing the world for the first time, not just getting so used to the sight of something that it's old to you. And so in this case, I think it reminds all of us not to close our eyes to what seems to be commonplace, but really holds the essence of beauty. And there's another place in the first Moffats when Janie comments to Joey, they're in this wagon, the Salvation Army wagon, and Joey has the reins in his hands, and the man is asleep in the back, and Joey loses the way, and he's very embarrassed because he's lost the way in his own home territory, the way back to the green. And Jane says, but things look different behind a horse. So in a sense, this is the same idea.
One of your books that's a favorite across the country was published in 1944. It's The 100 Dresses, which has even been translated into Turkish. One way to appreciate Eleanor Estes's Newbery Honor book, The 100 Dresses, is through this episode with schoolgirls Mattie and Peggy, who are finishing a letter to a former classmate, Wanda Petronsky, who now lives in another city.
I picture Wanda alone, or in the back of the room with the dummies, in that same shabby light blue dress that she always wore. Faded, not even ironed well. And she'd have on that old gray toboggan cap that her brother Jake, the janitor's helper, must have found somewhere. And those queer, high-laced shoes.
The dress was always clean, Peggy. She probably had to wash it out every night with no time to iron it in the morning. She had no mother, you know.
I know, but the dress didn't hang right on her. And besides, why'd she have to lie that she had hundreds of dresses at home? I asked her once, where are they then? And she said, in my closet. Oh, you don't wear them to school? I told her in my super polite way. And she up and says, no, to parties.
I remember the first time she told us about the 100 dresses. Do you? It was in October, and Cecily first wore her new red dress with the cap and socks to match. Then everyone else began to brag. Marie said she got a new dress for dancing school, and Alice said she got a Stuart plaid. Poor Wanda just stood there alone. That's when she said she had the 100 dresses at home.
And the 60 pair of shoes, don't forget them. Every pair different, all colors, all lined up in her closet. Why'd she have to lie?
Don't you see why? Peggy, you're the richest and most popular girl in the school, and I'm proud you made me your best friend. But don't you see why? It must be hard for someone who has everything. I just shouldn't have joined you every morning when you waited for Wanda to play the 100 dresses game. And I should have said something to that bully when he made fun of her name. Petronsky-Onsky, he said, and he called her a Pollock. and I just stood there like a coward.
Maddie, come on. You don't want to carry on that way if you still want to be my best friend. You know I've never done anything cruel. I'm always protecting small children, and I cry for hours if I see an animal mistreated. Oh, you've seen me yourself. It's not my fault she's not named Thomas or Smith or Alan like the rest of us in room 13. If I was ever cruel to her, I didn't mean to be. Oh, Peggy, come on. Dry your eyes. That is, if you still want to be my best friend.
Oh, you know I still want to be your best friend.
Look at it this way, Maddie. If she hadn't described her gowns to us in such detail, she might not have won the girls' design contest for room 13. The rest of us did, what, 1 or 2 sketches, but she drew 100 dresses, 100 sketches. I thought I'd win the medal because, well, I'm so good at art. But you know what? She draws even better than me. Gee, I never thought that she had the sense to know that we were making fun of her. I thought she was too dumb.
Well, she wasn't. Not at all. Did you see how good she did that green dress with the red trimming that you kept asking her about? The girl who's wearing it has your same auburn hair.
And the blonde like you is wearing the blue dress that you always liked. She really could draw. But why did her father move with her and Jake before she could find out that she'd won the contest?
Well, that note he wrote the class said he was taking them to a big city where there were plenty of funny names, and no one could make fun of theirs anymore.
Well, we're doing the right thing to write to her and tell her that she won the contest. I just wish we had a better address than her old rundown house at Baggins Heights.
Look, I'll mark please forward on the envelope. You lick the stamp, and I'll put lots of X's for love at the bottom of the letter.
Wanda receives the letter and replies, giving Mattie and Peggy the drawings that look like them, the product of an artistic hand and a rich imagination. What were you thinking as you saw that?
Well, I think the little actresses are very gifted.
They're from Temple's drama department or
Yes.
radio, television, film department. I'm constantly moved at the content of that book. It's one of your greatest accomplishments because it's short, easy to read, and yet so meaty. We have several elementary school children here with us who've read that book. They want to ask you a question about it. They're here with their 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Sue Friedman. Call on Kenny Anderson.
How long did it take you to write the 100 dresses?
Well, actually, it took about 6 months, perhaps. Even though it's a short book, sometimes it takes even longer to write a short book than a long book because you want to make it just absolutely as right as you can. And that was a very tender and delicate book to write, and I didn't want to make one single misstep in it. But you know, when you say how long does it take to write a book, any book, it takes much longer than when I say, well, a year or 6 months or something, because your whole life has really gone into writing that book somehow.
Ada, do you have a question? Ada Aponte.
Why did Wanda move away?
Well, I don't think Wanda had very much to do with moving away. I think her father didn't want to see his children hurt at all and was responsible for moving away. Many children want to know why Wanda didn't come back and in the story so that it would seem to have a happier ending. But the point in my mind of the book was that there isn't a second chance for people, really. I mean, you have to, day by day, sort of treat everyone the way you'd like to be treated, because you can't have a chance to say, I'm sorry. It's the golden rule, really.
You know, others in the studio audience are from my class in literature, and they were making that very point last week, that you do not get a second chance in life. While we were focusing on the audience, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Rice Estes, husband of Eleanor Estes. And you know, Carolyn, you have a tremendous amount in common with all of these guests.
Yes, I do.
You two were former children's librarians, and Rice Estes, a professor of library science, right?
That's right.
Where did you meet him?
Well, we met in that library science library room at Pratt Institute. And if any of you have read Ginger Pie, well, the campus, where Mr. Pie meets Mrs. Pie, well, that's based on a story that Rice told me about one of his first employers, Mr. Asa Don Dickinson, who I think came from around here. And one day when my husband was taking the subway to Brooklyn College, he saw Mr. Asa Don Dickinson, who was a marvelous gentleman of the old school, a real scholarly type, running up the down escalator. So you see, when you're writing a book, strange stories come into your mind and you attach them to some other character, and that's how Mr. Pie met Mrs. Pie running up the down. He was running up the down escalator. I'm not putting any ideas in anybody's heads, I hope, because I don't think it's a safe thing to do, to run up down escalators.
Tell me, is your daughter Helena also a librarian or a writer?
Well, Helena wants to be a writer or an art historian, something of that sort, but at the moment she is a librarian in a public library in Long Island, and she writes beautifully, and hopefully maybe she will find time to write. After all, I was a children's librarian for many years before I found time to write. And her husband is working for his psychology degree, so they're both pretty busy young people. A Little Oven is about Helena.
Yes.
When she was a little girl.
Well, as a children's librarian and working with the children and seeing what they like to read, did that help you as a writer, do you think?
Yes, I'm sure it did, because originally I simply wanted to be a writer, to write. But having been a children's librarian for so many years, when I started to write, and the Moffats was my first book that I wrote at all, I think unconsciously I had to address myself to children. And so many children in the libraries I'd been in, their faces, their voices, and everything came back to me. And so they turned out to be books for children. Rufus M., do you remember the first chapter in Rufus M?
Yes,
when he joins the library?
Yes,
Well, actually, that chapter was based on a little girl that I knew at the George Bruce Branch Library in New Haven. And in those library rooms for children are on the second floor, tremendous libraries, you know. And for this little girl of 5 to keep coming up the stairs with that application blank, and she was determined to get a book. Well, that was Barbara Cooney, her name was. I remember it to this day.
Not Barbara Cooney.
No, another Barbara Cooney. Anyway, I transferred her to Rufus and his experience of. I remember, I'm sure you all remember, thinking you could read and thinking you could write. Writing was just simply jagged lines up and down, and reading seemed easy. People just flipped pages. So Rufus was determined to be part of the family in the Moffats.
One of my favorite illustrators is Louis Sablodkin, and of course he illustrated your first book.
Yes.
Did you get him going in the field? Because it was his first, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. There's a little story about the illustrations to the Moffats. Well, my first editor was Elizabeth Hamilton at Harker Grace, and she preceded Margaret. And she accepted the book and loved it and said she would find an illustrator for it, and asked what sort of pictures I liked. And I said I liked pen and ink drawings. Your eye would roll from text to picture, and so she said, all right, about in February. The book was to come out in this fall. I'll call you in. Which she did at the height of an awful blizzard. And I went in, and we were living in Brooklyn Heights at the time. I took the subway in, and she had all these pictures, and they were terrible, just simply awful. And I didn't know what to say. This was my first book, and I was so afraid to have it not published, and yet I couldn't say I liked them. So I went through the pictures one by one and explained how awful they seemed to me, really. I was very delicate about it, though. And at the end she said, well, I can see you really don't like these pictures, so you'll have to find an illustrator that you like. But if we don't like his pictures, then we will have to delay publication. So I called up our very good friend Louis Slobodkin, who is a sculptor, and he'd always done just tremendous pieces of sculpture. He's an architectural sculptor primarily. But I knew how beautifully he drew, and said, would you like to illustrate my book? He'd never read it even, and he said he would. He read it, and so we have the Moffat drawings. And of course he had started him off on a different career too.
Were the other drawings finished drawings, complete for the book, or only samples?
He drew, and well, he's so quick, he drew dozen or so pencil drawings.
No, I meant the
other ones, yes.
Complete?
Well, I was very firm about it. I said, I don't want the book published at all.
I can't believe that Elizabeth Hamilton would let you get away with it. I think that's great.
Well, yes, she would if she had sense, and she did.
Well.
You know, Margaret, you are very famous in your own right. Will you please tell us something about the role of an editor and why you think you two have hit it off so well?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? Well, I think an editor's role really is a middleman's role, to try and help, if he or she can, the author to say in the best possible way what it is the author has to say. And you never can, it's always the creative person you try to draw forth. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes not. But when it comes to the artist, I'm surprised. That's why I asked you if those were finished drawings, because usually one wants the author to see a sample or two first, and you can say at that point, no, they really aren't my idea of the illustrations, or yes, they are if the artist could change slightly or whatever.
They were finished, and they were on heavy cardboard, and I had taken them over to Brooklyn to show my husband and also to Louis that night. They both said, I don't see what you can do. But I did what I had to do.
Which was
now
right.
we have these lovely pictures in the books.
Would you tell us about the line of children's books in your own name at Athenaeum?
Well, that's a very great honor and a very nice thing. Sorry that has happened to me, because I was asked to join Athenaeum, and because they have a wonderful children's book department, started and continued by Jean Carl, who is the editor. I was asked to come and do my own books with my own name on the books over the Athenaeum imprint. Not only is it an honor, but it also helps to keep my books and Jean Carl's books separate. We're totally autonomous. We share the same designers and production and so forth. But it's a lovely thing, and it works beautifully. I'd like to go back to an earlier question. You said, why did Eleanor and I get along? Was it why?
Right,
how?
yes. What's the key
I
to the
think it's
reason
because of her lovely sense of humor, which we always, even when it's a difficult time or when there's a lot to be discussed. Am I not right, Eleanor? Always we've had a good time. And we solve things humorously and seriously, but they work out happily in the end.
I think that's the main thing about it, that Margaret's sense of humor and mine seem to coincide all the time. We have wonderful times on our journeys, and sometimes she makes me laugh so much, tears come down my cheeks, and people think I'm crying. I'm not, I'm happy.
You're on each other's wavelength in some way.
Which is really the only way I think an editor and an author can work together. If you're not, then it's too much of a struggle the whole time, and you're you're not quite understanding instinctively, which you almost have to do. And then out of that, I think, can come the rich, wonderful, whatever Eleanor writes or someone else.
I think it's frankness, too, that one, I expect Margaret to be frank, and she expects me to be frank. We trust each other, and that's it.
I think one of the reasons that Eleanor Estes books are so popular is because of the humor in them, which also comes from her as a writer and a human being. And today, the most popular subject for a book in the library is humor, which seems to be very logical. With life so difficult today, children see these problems on television, and they get the humor in your books.
But there are very few books that have humor.
That's
They are extremely difficult to write, I imagine.
Well, they happen. I don't think you can...
I think you're right. They happen. I think that you don't say to yourself, I'm going to write a funny book.
No.
But if you have a funny mind, it's going to come out to be a funny book. I remember when I was writing in the middle of Moffat, every day Rice would come home from work and would read the chapter of the day, and when he read the lamb chop chapter, he laughed so hard he had an attack of asthma. Well,
Success after all.
I knew it was a good chapter right in there.
Protect yourself a little bit more. Tell us, we know Frederick Melcher as the man who started the Newbery and Caldecott Awards. But how did he launch your editing career?
Well, it was a total surprise to me. I'd been overseas with the OWI during the war, stationed in London and Brussels. I came back, and I was on leave from the New York Public Library as a children's librarian, we all were. I went in off the street simply to say to Francis Sayers, I'm back, here I am, how are you? Broke up a meeting from which Mabel Williams, the head of work with young people in the New York Public, went out. She went over to Park Avenue, and at a light, there was Fred Melcher. He said, Harcourt Brace needs a children's book editor because Elizabeth Hamilton has left. And the only person I can think of is overseas. That's Margaret McElderry. And Elizabeth Williams said, no, she just got back yesterday. She's here. And that's the way it happened.
Oh, isn't that great?
Absolutely extraordinary.
You know, not only do you have a vivid sense of humor, but also imagination. And I would like to know if much of what's contained in your adult novel, The Echoing Green, is autobiographical, or is it the product of your imagination? Because I want to know, was someone in your family widowed early?
Well, yes. My books, of course, all the books, even the fantasies, are autobiographical in a sense, because they're me, but naturally, writers have to draw on their past, so some of the facts may be right, but largely they may be imaginary. I don't think I ever walked under a horse as I did in the Moffats, but I'm not sure. And once you've written something, you don't know whether something was made up or imaginary. You lose track of what was fact and what was fancy, and I would really have to reread The Echoing Green to answer you accurately there, but a lot of it is based on really remembered realism.
Is Cranberry, Connecticut fictitious?
It's a name for West Haven, Connecticut.
Well, you've done an ingenious job of placing both of your imaginary families there and having them know each other. I want to thank both of you very, very much for being with us. For over 35 years, you have been writing mainly gently humorous books for children, but also contributing to magazines. And during much of that time, you've had the advice, encouragement, and talent of a very capable editor who's become a trusted friend, Margaret McElderry. It's been a pleasure to have you as our guest.
Thanks.